In a previous installment, I demonstrated a step-by-step guide on how I made a brush-up silicone mould of a pre-existing mask. For this episode, I'll be putting that mould to use to slush cast a copy in resin, but with a twist. I'll be employing a process known as cold casting. Now, this realistically creates the effect that something's been forged from brass or whatever metallic finish it is that you desire, rather than looking like it's been simply poured from resin. Keep watching and I'll show you how this works. So, what exactly is cold casting then? Well, it's not as dramatic as it sounds. For a project like this, instead of going to all the trouble of creating a mould that could withstand the massively high temperature of about 1000 degrees Celsius that's needed to melt brass, then finding and going to a specialist foundry who would actually be willing to take on such a small project for you. No, all you simply do is add some brass powder to the resin of your choice. Polyurethane in my case. You then pour that concoction into your silicone mould and slosh it about a bit until the entire surface is covered. Once that's cured, you just pop it out, trim it, buff it up with some fine wire wool, polish the surface until it gleams, and then finally add a bit of weathering for some flavour. That is effectively it. I told you that it was simple, but let's take a closer look, shall we? The first step on our journey towards casting up our mask is to prep the mould. Now, this isn't strictly necessary, but it doesn't hurt to do it either, and that is to dust the mould with brass powder, the same material that we'll be mixing into the resin. Just a teaspoon is more than enough here. The mould is then rotated in every which direction to get a full and even coverage. If we weren't cold casting and just doing a simple resin pour, household talcum powder or even cornstarch could be employed here for the same reason. All the powder does is to help draw the resin down into all those lovely details of the mould and avoids the entrapment of air that would ordinarily leave ugly and unsightly bubbles across the surface, which is something that's less than desirable on a project like this. Once sufficiently and evenly distributed, the mould is then upended and tapped to release the extraneous loose powder that we don't need. To save on waste, a pre-folded sheet of paper is laid down, opened up of course, to catch the excess material, and this is then recovered for later use. The mould is now pretty much ready to accept our first pour, the cold cast brass layer. Right, my friends, we're getting into the meat of the project here. Now, this is where the magic happens. To get that realistic metal finish, brass in this case, I'll be adding actual brass powder to some polyurethane casting resin that I purchased from DWR Plastics. Before I committed to the project, I first had to run a few tests just to see what mix ratio would give me the result that would best match the appearance that I was looking for. I wanted my mask to look antique, as if it was forged from brass that had dulled over the centuries, and after a few goes I dialed it in to a point where I was happy. This particular resin is an AB type formula, where you mix equal amounts of resin to catalyst by weight to get the exothermic reaction going that causes it to cure. First, I just spend 75 grams of resin into cup A, and then 75 grams of catalyst into cup B. Setting cup B aside, I then added close to 4 grams of black tint to cup A, and stirred this in thoroughly. This just adds a dark contrasting tone to make the metallic powder stand out and pop. Now, I'm using a little more tint than I normally would here, but this is only because I want my brass effect to look distinctly old. If you want your effect to look newer and brighter, then just add less tint. When it came to adding the brass powder, I had to think differently. Because metal is obviously heavier than resin, I could no longer work to ratios by weight. Instead, I went by volume and simply eyeballed it. Using cups A and B as a guide, I filled cup C to more or less the same level as the other two. As it turned out, the brass weighed in at 250 grams, which is 3.3 times heavier than each constituent part, or 1.66 times heavier than parts A and B combined. So if you want to have a bash at this yourself, these ratios should give you a good starting point for your own experiments. The final step before pouring is to combine all our parts. First, I slowly sifted the brass powder from cup C into cup A, making sure to continuously stir throughout to avoid clumping. Now this can take a while, but it is worth it to achieve an evenly distributed mix. I then poured this into cup D, which is larger than the others to account for the increased volume, and while stirring to prevent the heavy brass particles from settling at the bottom of the cup, I added the catalyst from cup B. Now that the mix is catalysed, I had a working time of about 5 minutes. Actually, this can vary depending on the ambient temperature where you're working. Right now it's fairly cool, so the pot life is slightly extended, but if you're working in the height of summer, then this can be drastically reduced, so keep an eye out for that. With my mould clamped together and dusted with powder, the resin can now be poured straight in. I'm quick to swirl the mould around to get an even coverage, but careful enough to make sure that I don't trap any air down in all those lovely details. The trick here is to go easy with it. We're not using centrifugal force, but a continuous movement of material, so you don't need to throw your mould around like a whirling dervish, that's just completely unnecessary. No, the mould is simply rotated, tipped, rocked and flipped until the resin thickens and eventually stops moving. When all the resin movement has ceased, then we can set it down to rest, but not for too long, I might add. You know what we've done just a mere moment or two ago? Well, now we do exactly the same thing again, only this time without the brass powder. You know the drill. Decant part A, decant part B, add tint, mix A and B together, pour this into the mould, swirl it around until it gels, set it aside, and then wait. Now, I left this to cure fully for a good hour, though the directions do actually say that the demoulding can be done within 20 to 30 minutes, but I found, to my detriment I might add, that this is not entirely the case. On my first ever test pour, I went by the user guide and demoulded it at the half-hour mark as directed, but unfortunately it just stretched and tore apart, rendering it an immediate bin decoration. Shall I crack it open? No. It'll do it itself. Thank you very much. Now that I've reached the final phase of the process, the first thing that I do is to release the clamps, separate the support shell, and gently ease the casting out of the silicone mould to see what I've got. This is the moment of truth. Is it a good pull or not? So far so good. In case you're wondering what I'm doing here, I'm just checking my cast against the original to ensure that every detail and defect has been perfectly reproduced. I see that they have been, so that's great and I can move on. Now it's time to trim off the flashing and remove the eye and mouth blanks, but that bit's really boring, so I'll skip over that for you. Don't worry, you're not missing much. With quadruple zero wire wool, I lightly buff up the surface to reveal the brass content within, but not hard enough to take away any of the surface detail. I then polish everything up with Brasso to make it gleam. Now, given what I'm about to do next, this pass may seem pointless to you, but trust me, it's worth it. Using some bog standard artist acrylic paint, black knocked back with a bit of brown and mixed with plenty of water, I washed this over everything and lightly dab it off with a rag to remove the excess. I also go back in with more black in a wet on wet technique to punch up the shadow areas to give it more definition. Yes, I know it looks rather over the top here and may look rather incinerated to you right now, and no, that's not what I'm aiming for here. The magic comes next. Once allowed to dry, either naturally or via a blow dryer, it's time to get the wire wool and the polish out again, and repeat the earlier process once more, but this time with more gusto. We really want this thing to gleam and shine. And we're done. There you have it, a resin mask that looks like it's been made from brass, and best of all, it's something that you can have a go at yourself within the confines of your own home. That's if you want to, of course. So, why not give it a whirl and let me know how you got on down in the comments section below, as I always love to hear from you all. So until next time, thank you so much for joining me today, and if you haven't already seen it, be sure to check out my in-depth step-by-step tutorial on silicone mould making, as within it are several hardly ever spoken about tips that I really think you'll find quite useful. Stay safe my friends, and we'll chat again soon.